Hi everyone, it's Ren here speaking. I hope you're well, guys. Welcome to my room. Today we're going to be taking another question from a viewer. It's a question that recurs often, both from within the community that's interested in Myers-Briggs and Jungian psychology in general, and the psychology of types, but also from outside the community, often from voiced by critics who consider that the theory has too many flaws to be taken seriously or is outdated or whatever you want to call it, sometimes from more sympathetic critics. The question is, can type change? Is type a fluid thing? If you're a person of a certain type, can you become a person of another type at a later point? And before I move on to this topic, just keep in mind that I have written a book on the INFJ personality. It's called the Ecstatic Soul and it has a very nice cover, and it's people are really liking it. So if you want to deepen your understanding of the INFJ personality, you've covered the basics, function stack, the main articles in the literature you're familiar with, but you want to get a deeper sense of what the INFJ consciousness is like, what it feels like to be an INFJ, what the main life challenges are and how to address them and live a fulfilling existence. This is the book to get, less than $10. All the links in the description box below to all the Amazon websites, ebook, paperback. If you have any questions, you let me know. Right, so can type change? Now, the familiar answer, the one that we probably all know, is that type cannot change. But here, what I want to focus on is the reason why type cannot change and why it would be incoherent for the theory, the Jungian theory, to posit that type can change. Okay? So in other words, I want to defend the approach, the theory according to which type cannot change, by showing why it's the only plausible articulation of the theory within that set of parameters laid down by Jung. Jung has a very strong concept of the self and individuation. If you're familiar with Jung, you know this. You know that Jung very strongly believed that there is such a thing as the self, that every person has a psyche, that the self is something deeper than the psyche. The self has a psyche rather than the psyche having a self. And that each and every one of us has a self, and that the journey of individuation is about how to, in some sense, become the most synthetic kind of self that you can. It's like a harmonic sort of self, where all the cognitive functions are arranged in such a way as to lead an existence that doesn't encounter obstacles. It's like leading your existence as a melody in some way, and there's a clear Nietzsche influence there. The moments that a self is posited, there's the question, what is the identity of this self? And the reason why type cannot change is because, again, according to Jung, there is a distinction between two types of identity. A lot of the time people don't realize this. And the ambiguity around this notion of identity and it not being sufficiently clarified in conversation tends to lead to mistakes in judgment. There is what philosophers call numerical identity, and there is what people call qualitative identity. So, imagine, okay, you see there's this book here, right? So just wait for a second. Well, this is my first novel. If you're interested, the link is also down below, but I'll use this book instead. So this is a copy of the Ecstatic Soul, this wonderful book that you can get for less than $10, and it has a lovely cover. Imagine just having that on your bookshelves. Lovely. But anyway, this lovely cover is something that this book has, but that book over here has it as well, you see? So for philosophers, and you'll understand why this is important, And it makes sense. These two books here are qualitatively identical. They have the same qualities, right? Same cover, same width, same weight, so on and so forth. So there's a qualitative identity between these two books. However, when it comes to numerical identity, these two books are not the same. There's only one such book. This book is numerically identical with itself. This book is not that book. These are two different books. They're qualitatively identical. They have the same qualities, but they're numerically distinct. There's only one book like this one. And to illustrate further, suppose I were to grab a pen and just cross a line, do something terrible and mess with the cover. Just like cross the line, like a thick line across it. Now this book would no longer be either numerically identical with that book, but it would no longer be qualitatively identical, because it would have a different cover. There would be a line across it that would not be on that other book. So at that point, we would say that this book is, numerically identical with itself, but no longer qualitatively identical with that book. But there is another further thing that we can point out, is that this book would no longer be qualitatively identical with its earlier version when I had not yet crossed the line across the cover. However, throughout the whole process, this book remains numerically identical with itself. So the numerical identity of an object does not change. The qualitative identity changes over time. It can be, I can even tear off this cover page and do something terrible, and it would still be the same book. Not qualitatively the same, but numerically the same. Okay, so hopefully you get the point. Now, the final point to make is that in order for the qualities that this book has to evolve, to change, different cover, I can scribble on the page, tear off the page, do whatever I want with it. In order for that to be possible, there is the necessary precondition, which is assumed, that of numerical identity. If this book was not numerically identical with itself over, time, essentially, that it could never be not what it is, there could be no qualitative change. Okay? Now, that is the reason why type cannot change. Because according to Jung, cognitive functions are not qualities that the self has. Okay, that's the essential point. It's like, suppose I have a beard. This is a quality. Of course it can change. I can shave. I have hair. If I became completely bald, that would change. I have blue eyes. If I were to put on lenses, or if I were to lose my sense of sight, or maybe something terrible happened to my eyes, I will no longer have blue eyes. So there's a lot of things that are qualities that are part of my identity in a qualitative sense, and that can change over time. Certainly that can change. In fact, you could say that, for example, someone being egotistical, or someone being avaricious, someone being optimistic, a lot of these dispositional traits that describe the temperaments, they're also qualitative. And Jungian theory does not pretend that that's not the case. In other words, Jungian theory is not saying that people cannot change. Of course they can change, and that's completely fine. But what it says is that the cognitive functions are concepts that describe the numerical identity of the self, not the qualitative identity. And that's the distinction that people often pass by. And that's why they sometimes find it hard to make sense of the claim that the cognitive functions, that type cannot change. You have to think that type is not a way of describing the qualities of a person that can change over time. They're a way of describing the self, the substrate, a way of capturing the cognitive substrate that comes to have qualities that themselves change over time. So if you take this book, imagine that this book is the self, right? The cognitive functions are not anything that describes what you see here. What you see here, like you could imagine that it represents maybe a beard or clothes or particular temperaments that can change over time. But this book as a unit, as a numerical identity, this book itself, the self, by analogy, is captured by, among other things, what we describe as type, as the cognitive functions. The cognitive functions in type are part of they're not part of the self, they are the self. They're a way of describing the self from a certain perspective with a certain kind of vocabulary. And then attached to that come different dispositions that are, of course, channeled in different ways according to what cognitive function stack you have. So a person who is altruistic at a certain point in time, but whose self can be described as INFJ, will have a differently expressed kind of altruism than the person who's altruistic, but whose self is described as ISTP. Different types of altruism. The altruism can change, but the self cannot change. So this is the simple reason why type in Jungian theory cannot change, because it would be the same as saying the self can become different from itself. Of course, the self cannot become different from itself. The self endures over time, has to remain numerically identical, which is precisely why we can account for changes in the qualities that are ways of attaching to the self. So always think that type is a way of getting directly to the nature of the self itself, not its qualities. And once you have that in mind, it will become a lot clearer why type cannot change. Type is a way of describing the self. Let me know what you think in the comments, guys. Give a like and consider subscribing. Bye-bye.